Hello, thanks for joining me for this Open Pedagogy session. This is a high-level overview of Open Pedagogy and Practices delivered on August 24th, 2021 for the Open Pedagogy Community of Practice. Most often we hear open pedagogy and open educational practices termed in direct relation to open educational resources. OER are resources that we learn from, so any learning resource or material that is openly licensed in a way that allows others to adapt and reshare. This is often indicated with Creative Commons licensing. In today's session, I want to overview some of the common theories and frameworks surrounding open educational practices and open pedagogy. What we find is that open educational practices and pedagogies are generally enabled by open educational resources, but don't always rely on them. At this point in the presentation, I'd like to pause and allow for some reflection before we really move into what the research is showing us and what has been published around this work. Think back to the experience that you're providing to your students and the experience that you've had as a student yourself. What does open mean to you in that context? What is the environment that you want to create for your students' learning, and how does openness enable or amplify that? The first framework I want to show you is based on a research article from Maha Bali, Catherine Cronin, and Rajiv Jangiani. They collaborated on this article that really looks at open pedagogy and open educational practices through the lens of social justice. And it identifies different typologies in how our practices are emerging and how they could be categorized. First of all, I want to point out that each line item here is actually a spectrum. So the first one we look at is content-centric to process-centric. Of course, we can exist anywhere along those lines, but generally, as open practitioners, we're choosing between being focused on the content or focused on the process. The second line item we have here is teacher-centric to learner-centric. This one here, I often get a lot of controversial discussions around and misunderstandings. So certainly I encourage looking at the literature a bit deeper to assess where you fit and where your practice fits in this spectrum. But we're really looking at teacher-centric being the teaching practice and its access to other teachers or other teaching practitioners. And on the other side of the spectrum, we're looking at learner-centric. So we're focusing on the learning activities, the learner engagement, and improving learning outcomes. The third line item here we have spans from pedagogical focus to social justice focus. And again, we may feel like we can't quite fit on one or the other. It's in the middle or it's both. And currently what is emerging in the literature and the research is that we are often looking at open education as a field a little too broadly. What we can see here is there's different pockets of activity that fit into very specific situations and needs, and giving credit to those activities is important. In Hegarty's model of attributes of open pedagogy, it's very clear that the way that we engage our students in open practices goes beyond resources. Those open educational resources may enable these activities, but the attributes of open pedagogy really come down to the activities and the ways that we engage our students. So you can see around this circle here, we have the very top is participatory technology. Now, this is a whole webinar on its own, digging into technologies that enable participation and perhaps segue into the other attributes we see here. Participatory technologies are certainly one way of getting closer to developing openness and trust in your classroom, connecting your students with community and creating a connected community, and of course, sharing ideas and resources. But when we look at the other attributes of open pedagogy, we see a core function of learner-generated listed here. And that really ties into whether it is something that is shared openly or not, or whether it is an experience that is shared openly or not. This really opens up the conversation of digital literacies and the comfort level that our instructors and our students may or may not have in learning in an open space. One definition that I found really interesting around open education is the definition of an open educator developed by Nascimene and Burgos. In 2016, they identified what they defined as an open educator, and the intersections with Hegarty's model in this are really interesting. I can see how if we intersected the removal of unnecessary barriers to learning with the different attributes of open pedagogy, we would be able to find ways to remove and reduce the barriers to learning in our classrooms. Of course, open educational resources is one of the primary ways that we've seen popularized through the open education movement, and rightfully so. Another thing that is referenced here in the open educator description is that the individual has an open online identity. I found this really telling and interesting around what we define as participatory technology and what we define as open. I don't know that I agree that every open educator, to be termed as such, needs to have an open online identity or rely on social networking or social media. Certainly, it's 2021 now, so I think there has been some progress and differentiation along those lines since 2016. This diagram comes from Catherine Cronin's work, and it aligns really nicely when we're talking about the decisions that instructors and students make about how open their learning process should or can be. The exterior of the circle shows common perspectives of individuals who are teaching with open practices. At the top, we see the value of social learning. When we look at the collaborative practices that are involved in open pedagogies, such as interaction and participation using social networks, peer learning, knowledge creation, and empowering students to design and explore their own learning process, we can see that open pedagogies directly connects with social learning. Cycling down to the bottom, we talk about how instructors are integrating models of openness into their teaching, and generally that challenges the traditional views of teaching roles at their institution. This is where we connect to the concept of open pedagogies and the fact that they're not just limited to OER. Certainly often enabled by OER, but it's often something that's happening all around us. I know at the University of Alberta, I'm already surrounded by instructors who are doing unique and non-traditional things with their students, and it is open pedagogy, but we just haven't applied an open lens to it yet. In the center, we see two balancing points that we touched on earlier. Instructors and students are continually developing new digital literacies because the online world and the technology that surrounds us is constantly changing. Instructors who are teaching with open pedagogies encounter situations where it's necessary to balance the privacy and the openness and evaluate when and how it is appropriate for the learning to be openly visible or accessible. For instructors to approach open pedagogies in an equitable and ethical way that they're comfortable with, the instructor and the students need to have the knowledge and the agency surrounding some decisions impacting their online presence and the visibility of their learning process. In conclusion, I'd like to point to Nascimene and Burgos' definition of an open educator. In 2016, they defined an open educator as someone who is openly sharing their ideas and plans and engaging with a wide variety of stakeholders by transparently leaving a trace of their development process. They point to open educators using open licenses as a venue to facilitate sharing. That open educators adapt and assemble open teaching materials and release their own to the teaching commons. Nascimene and Burgos tell us that open educators foster the co-creation of knowledge by students, not just online but offline as well, through empowering learners to contribute to public knowledge. Finally, open educators don't just assess the learning on their own, they engage students and external stakeholders in the assessment of learning. To close this session, I invite you to reflect on the attributes of open pedagogy. Where and how do these show up in your teaching practice? Where and how do these show up in your teaching practice? If you were to look at your course design, implementation, assessment, and evaluation, where do you or would you like to apply an open lens to your approach?